Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving headfirst into one of history's greatest cold cases. We are talking about the sudden, highly mysterious collapse of the thriving Late Bronze Age around 1200 BCE. This era absolutely fascinates me because we aren't just looking at the fall of a single city or a bad year for crops. We're talking about the abrupt, violent transformation of an entire interconnected world spanning the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. So let's jump right into the evidence.
To really grasp the sheer scale of this mystery, we've got to set the scene. Picture it. It's roughly 1250 BCE, and the ancient Mediterranean is thriving. We're talking enormous palaces, insanely busy ports, and merchant ships crisscrossing the sea. You've got magnificent Egyptian temples, towering Hittite fortresses, mighty Mycenaean citadels, and Cypriot traders moving massive amounts of wealth. It was an incredibly sophisticated system. So, the million-dollar question we have to answer today is this. How could such an advanced, highly functioning, and seemingly invincible ancient world just crumble?
Let's set the stage. Part 1. A thriving ancient world. Think about the stark contrast of what happened here. We go from the absolute pinnacle of human achievement at the time to total devastation. Bustling ports are suddenly replaced by damaged, abandoned palaces. Those busy merchant ships, they just stop arriving. Grain stores run critically low. We transition from these vibrant, ultra-wealthy kingdoms to empty roads and smoke rising from ruined cities. It's a chilling before and after picture, like something right out of a dystopian movie.
To figure out why this happened, we really need to talk about the era's namesake, the Bronze Age. Now, bronze isn't something you just dig out of the ground. It's an alloy. You have to mix copper and tin to make it. But here is the massive geopolitical catch. Copper and tin were almost never located in the same geographic regions. Because of this one simple geological fact, these ancient civilizations were 100% dependent on long-distance trade. Without trade, you have no bronze. Without bronze, you have no tools, no weapons, and ultimately, no power.
Which leads us perfectly into Part 2, the interconnected trade web.
The economic web of this era was just mind-boggling. You had copper pouring out of Cyprus, tin arriving from distant regions, massive shipments of timber coming from the Levant, and vital, life-sustaining grain flowing from agricultural powerhouses. Rulers were exchanging these baseline survival goods right alongside unbelievable luxury items. This system generated unprecedented wealth for the elites, but, and this is a huge but, it also created a highly dangerous shared vulnerability. It's like a giant house of cards. If one link in that supply chain breaks, everybody feels the pain.
And it wasn't just physical stuff moving across the map. Enter the Amarna ladders. This cache of clay tablets proves that this was a world of incredibly sophisticated diplomacy. We're talking scribes and kings communicating across hundreds of miles, arranging strategic marriage alliances, requesting military backup, and exchanging lavish tributes. They were actively, constantly working to maintain this really delicate balance of international power. To give you an idea of just how much stability this diplomacy could achieve, look at Ramesses II and the Hittites. The Hittite Empire was a massive, formidable rival to ancient Egypt. They clashed famously at the Battle of Kadesh. But the outcome wasn't just endless, destructive warfare. Instead, it eventually resulted in one of history's first famous peace treaties. This proves the Late Bronze Age wasn't just a brutal free-for-all. It was an era of profound international cooperation and political negotiation.
But of course, things were about to change. Part 3. First signs of collapse.
Suddenly, the clues we find in the dirt and the texts get pretty terrifying. Over in Mycenaean Greece, incredibly fortified palatial citadels were abruptly destroyed or just completely abandoned. The administrative tablets they left behind reveal massive, frantic shifts in their political systems. Then you have Ugarit, this wildly wealthy commercial hub on the Syrian coast. The final clay letters discovered there show the city making desperate pleas for help. They were begging for assistance that never arrived. Shortly after those letters were sent, the city was wiped out.
So what was actually happening? Well, historians go back and forth on the exact sequence of events, because frankly, it was a mess. You've got an overwhelming number of overlapping pressures developing all at once. We see evidence of political instability, warfare, and internal rebellions. We see signs of mass migration, severe drought leading to horrifying food shortages, the total breakdown of those vital trade routes we just talked about, and on top of all that, a cluster of severe earthquakes. It wasn't just one bad day. The crisis hit different regions at different times. Some cities literally burned to the ground, while others simply packed up and changed where they lived just to survive.
This brings us to our prime suspects, Part 4, the mysterious Sea Peoples.
First off, it is absolutely crucial to understand that Sea Peoples is a modern label. It's largely based on ancient Egyptian records that mention various groups, names like the Peliset, the Sheridan, the Shekelesh. But make no mistake, this was not a unified ancient nation. They weren't a single superpower launching a coordinated world war. Scholars to this day are debating their origins. Some theories link them to the Aegean, others to Anatolia, Cyprus, the Levant, or even just a massive, chaotic mix of different populations.
So we really can't just point a finger and say, aha, the Sea Peoples did it. We can't automatically identify them as the sole cause of the Bronze Age collapse. The reality is way more complicated. The Sea Peoples were very likely a desperate mix of migrating families, displaced warriors looking for a new home, and refugees fleeing those exact droughts, famines, and earthquakes we just discussed. They were probably a symptom of the collapse just as much as they were a cause.
Meanwhile, the story takes a wild turn. Part 5. Egypt fights for survival.
The records carved into the stone at Medinet Habu are basically an ancient action movie. They show Egypt fighting desperately for its very existence. Pharaoh Ramesses III faced massive, overwhelming threats from the sea. These dramatic stone reliefs depict chaotic, epic naval battles against these sea peoples. Egypt poured its vast resources into defending its borders, literally fighting tooth and nail to push back the tide of migrants and warriors descending upon the Nile Delta.
And here's the real kicker, the most fascinating takeaway of this whole explainer. Egypt survived. While the mighty Hittite Empire shattered, while the Mycenaean palaces were left to rot, and while Levantine commercial hubs were burned to ash, ancient Egypt remained standing as a major civilization. This survival is a massive clue, and it totally forces us to rethink the mechanics of this mystery.
So how do we make sense of this? Part 6. A systemic domino effect.
It really makes you wonder, if an empire like Egypt could physically fight off the threats, why did the rest of the Bronze Age world fail so spectacularly? The answer lies exactly in that word, interconnected.
Let's walk through this step by step. Think of it like a terrifying domino effect. Step 1. A disruption happens. Maybe it's a drought, maybe an earthquake, and trade networks stop functioning. Step 2. Because everyone relies on their neighbors, vital resources and food instantly become scarce. Step 3. Starving populations have literally no choice but to pack up and migrate. Step 4. Massive waves of desperate migrants lead to increased regional conflict and warfare over whatever resources are left. And finally, Step 5. This warfare makes the remaining trade routes deadly, completely severing the last lifelines of these civilizations and causing a total systemic collapse. It is a fatal loop.
Just picture all these major heavyweights sitting right at the precipice. Hattusa, Ugarit, Mycenae, Cyprus, and Egypt. They were all linked together, about to be struck by multiple overlapping disasters. A disruption in just one of these nodes sent devastating shockwaves rippling through the entire system.
It really comes down to this idea. The Bronze Age world had survived wars before. It had survived rival kings, it had survived political crises, but this time, something was fundamentally different. The system was remarkably resilient against single, isolated threats, but it was entirely, tragically unprepared for a simultaneous, multi-front systemic failure.
And that brings us to the end of our explainer today. I want to leave you with a question to chew on. When you look at the ashes of the late Bronze Age, what do you see? Was it one fatal blow, like an invading army or a sudden climate shift? Or was it a perfect storm of systemic dominoes that no empire on Earth could possibly survive? The evidence really points to a complex, tragic web of compounding disasters that completely rewrote ancient history. Thanks so much for joining me today, and keep questioning the past.
Welcome back, Focus Learners, to another Explainer. Today, we're cracking open one of history's absolute greatest cold cases. We're traveling back over 3,000 years to look at the Late Bronze Age. This was an era of colossal empires, towering cities, and a highly interconnected world that, well, quite suddenly, just crumbled. How does a thriving, international network of powerful civilizations simply fall apart? Let's find out.
So what if the Bronze Age collapse wasn't caused by just one single enemy? It's a fascinating question, right? For the longest time, people wanted a really simple answer, a single villain. But I want you to picture the final years of the Late Bronze Age. Keep in mind, some of these massive empires had literally existed for thousands of years before this sudden snapping point. Picture a farmer looking out over a completely dry, cracked field. Picture merchants standing at an empty harbor just waiting for cargo ships that are never going to arrive. Picture scribes frantically recording rapidly shrinking food supplies, and terrified refugees traveling along these ancient, dusty roads. These aren't just dramatic movie scenes. These represent the very real, overlapping pressures that began to squeeze this ancient world.
Okay, let's dive into this sequence. Paleoclimate research, stuff like fossilized pollen pulled from ancient lakes, has given us a massive clue here. Scientists have found solid evidence of periods of severely reduced rainfall and prolonged drought across parts of the eastern Mediterranean, right around the exact time of the collapse. And you can trace a direct chain reaction. Less rain means reduced harvests and livestock losses. That immediately leads to food shortages. And, when people are starving, competition for resources just skyrockets, leading straight to massive political instability. Environmental pressure made these already vulnerable societies significantly less resilient to any other shocks that came their way.
So, how does an empire survive when the fields feeding its cities can no longer produce enough food? It's a terrifying rhetorical question, for sure, but it perfectly bridges the gap between a bad climate cycle and a catastrophic societal collapse. You see, the rulers of these empires had a massive responsibility. They had to feed tens of thousands of people in their enormous cities, their huge workforces, their armies, and their administrators. If the harvests fail repeatedly, the entire political system starts to violently shake. So the absolutely crucial point here is how these societies were actually structured. Let's look at the Hittite and Mycenaean worlds, for example. They ran on what we call palace economics. The centralized palace controlled absolutely everything, literally down to the last grain of wheat. We've actually found clay tablets recording exact numbers of sheep, craft production, taxation, military organization. The whole shebang flowed right through the palace. Now, centralized systems are incredibly powerful when the gears are turning smoothly. But if that central palace fails, say because it can't distribute food anymore, the entire administrative network simply goes silent. The scribes stop writing, the storage rooms empty out, and the whole system is paralyzed. Plus, you can't have a Bronze Age without, well, bronze. But here's the catch. To make it, you need copper and tin. Tin was so rare it had to be imported all the way from modern-day Afghanistan. Think about that distance. This required highly secure international trade routes. Ships carrying these vital resources across the Mediterranean were the absolute lifeblood of this era. So imagine those trade networks breaking down. Ships disappear. Ports go quiet. Without those raw materials, the military and economic engines of these empires just grind to a total halt. This really highlights the double-edged sword of their world, systemic vulnerability. When your economy relies on a massive international web, what happens when one region just stops supplying a resource? The consequences ripple everywhere. An interconnected system is fantastic for growth, sure, but it means a localized crisis can rapidly, and I mean rapidly, become a global catastrophe. Now, we also have to factor in the ground literally shaking beneath their feet. The Eastern Mediterranean is a highly tectonically active zone. Archaeologists have indeed found evidence of what we call earthquake storms, which is just a terrifying concept, right? A series of devastating seismic events hit some Bronze Age sites during this period. But we have to be super clear here. While earthquakes caused severe local destruction and definitely added to the overall misery, they weren't the single killer of the era. They were just one more immense pressure on a system already stretched to its absolute breaking point. Which brings us to a huge question. Did the Sea Peoples cause the collapse? Ah, the famous Sea Peoples. If you've heard anything about the Bronze Age collapse, you've probably heard of them. Ancient Egyptian records prominently feature groups like the Peliset or the Shurden arriving from the sea, describing them as massive military threats. For decades, they were the ultimate historical scapegoats. The villains who supposedly sailed in and just burned the world down. But is that really the whole story? Well, modern historians have completely reframed the Sea Peoples. The evidence just doesn't support the idea that they alone destroyed the Bronze Age. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how we can see them as both a symptom of the wider crisis and a contributor to it. With droughts, famines, and collapsing economies, massive populations were displaced. These were mobile refugees, people desperate for survival, looking for new homes, and yes, sometimes acting as warriors and raiders out of pure necessity. They were a product of a world already falling apart. To truly understand the collapse, we have to look at the map, because this was absolutely not a uniform overnight apocalypse. Let's compare two major players. The mighty Hittite Empire faced internal pressures, military threats, and likely severe environmental stress. Their majestic capital, Hattusa, was eventually abandoned and destroyed, and the imperial state collapsed.
But the Hittite people didn't just vanish. Their culture survived in smaller kingdoms. Meanwhile, over in Mycenaean Greece, the massive palaces were destroyed, and their writing system, Linear B, completely disappeared. But again, the Greek population didn't disappear. Their society simply reorganized into smaller, entirely different communities.
And we see this varied impact everywhere we look. Over on the island of Cyprus, highly strategic copper production was severely disrupted. Along the Levantine coast, vital cosmopolitan trade centers like Ugarit experienced total destruction. In fact, in Ugarit, archaeologists actually found a desperate clay tablet pleading for help against enemy ships, a tablet baked solid by the very fire that destroyed the city. So the collapse was really a staggered series of these highly unique local tragedies. No single identical collapse happened everywhere.
All right, bringing us to the domino effect, a chain reaction. Let's watch this system completely break down. It starts like this. The rain stops, the fields dry up, the harvests fail. Almost immediately, the giant palace storehouses start to empty out. The rulers can't feed their people anymore. And just like that, trust in the government completely evaporates.
With governments weakening, borders become unsafe. Pirates and refugees take to the seas. Trade ships stop sailing. Suddenly, the copper and tin stop flowing. You can't make bronze weapons. You can't pay or supply your armies. The entire military defense network just crumbles.
So what happens next? Starving, undefended citizens begin to rebel against the silent palaces. Whole cities empty out as people migrate, desperately searching for food, crashing into neighboring states that are also starving. The interconnected web violently snaps. Total systemic collapse. It's like a giant house of cards just falling in on itself. It's a breathtaking sequence of events, honestly. But as the dust settles on the abandoned palaces and the quiet harbors, we really have to recognize a fundamental truth here. The Bronze Age did not end with one dramatic, final movie-style battle sequence. Civilization itself didn't just turn off the lights and disappear into thin air. It ended through a painful, gradual transformation. Collapse, you see, creates a blank slate. And this brilliantly illustrates how, out of the ashes of the Bronze Age palaces, a completely new world emerged. Without the massive international bronze trade, people turned to a metal they could find much more locally: iron. The Iron Age began. Power decentralized. Entirely new kingdoms developed, fresh trade networks were formed, and new political powers appeared on the world stage. So let's deliver the final historical verdict for this explainer. The mystery just isn't solved by pointing a finger at one single thing. The myth is that it was one invading army, or a simultaneous global destruction, or just a really bad drought. But the reality? The reality is far more complex and, honestly, far more fascinating. It was an interconnected systemic crisis. It was regional transformations. It was a massive, unlucky convergence of environmental stress, political instability, economic disruption, and massive human migration. It was the ultimate chain reaction. The Bronze Age civilizations built enormous cities, negotiated international treaties, and honestly, they seemed powerful enough to last forever. But their power depended on systems they couldn't fully control. It reminds us of a really crucial truth. Every civilization depends on food, trade, and stability. What systems do we depend on today? I mean, think about it. Over 3,000 years later, our own world is more globally interconnected than the Bronze Age rulers could have ever dreamed of. The ruins of Hattusa and Mycenae stand as a brilliant, haunting reminder. No empire exists entirely alone. Thank you so much for learning with me today, and keep questioning history.